Could I, on behalf of the British Council, which has commissioned this debate from Intelligence Squared, welcome every one of you to this evening's debate. There are, I understand, something like 700 people in this room. There could easily have been double that number from the response we got. And we are going to be joined by something like 70 million viewers from BBC World when the edited version of this debate broadcasts next month. But I think it's worth just spending a moment or two asking the question, well, why does an organisation like the British Council get involved in debates of this kind? We are the UK's global cultural relations organisation. We build trust and engagement for Britain around the world. We generate trust through knowledge and collaboration and through the exchange of views. And this debate is part of our Shared Europe programme, a programme which looks at the contributions Muslims have made to Europe, a contribution of the past, the present and indeed of the future. And the growing friction between Muslims and non-Muslims in Europe is one of the major cultural relations issues of our time. It would be irresponsible, we believe, for an organisation like the British Council to sidestep it. We don't take sides, though we are adamant in upholding the Western norms of citizenship and human rights as they affect both sides of the argument. And of course they do. The core message from our Shared Europe is that Muslims are an integral part of Europe, integral part in the past, an integral part now, and an integral part of our combined future. In terms of the debate itself, we believe that the recent prominence of this issue in a number of books, most recently Christopher Caldwell's Reflections on the Revolution in Europe, and much journalism, makes it a key cultural debate of our time. We don't view it as a debate primarily about faith, but as a debate about culture and the place of cultures, not culture, in European societies. And for example, when we were discussing this earlier on with a French North African community activist, and we'd been talking about whether it is appropriate for an organisation, a cultural relations organisation, to be launching this sort of project, and whether or not it would actually place an uncomfortable focus on Muslims that they themselves may not welcome, the answer we got was, we feel we are trapped in a cellar and lack oxygen. Your project gives us this oxygen. And tonight's debate is a small contribution to providing some oxygen in a debate which we believe is of critical importance for the long-term future of all of our citizens here in Europe. I know our speakers will not shy away from the very difficult issues that it exposes. I also know that you yourselves will also express your views with vigour and with clarity. I very much look forward to hearing them all and indeed to seeing how you all vote at the end. Thank you for coming. I commend to you Zainab and our panel of speakers, and to our partners in this enterprise, Intelligence Squared.
Welcome to Cadogan Hall here in central London for this Intelligence Squared debate, coming to you in association with the British Council. The motion, Europe is failing its Muslims. Well, although we're focusing on Muslims in Europe, this is a topic which is relevant right throughout the world. And we have a panel of some of the most provocative and stimulating speakers on this subject, and there'll be plenty of disagreement. And we'll be hearing later from our audience. So our panel, for the motion, Tariq Ramadan and Petra Steenan, and arguing against the motion, Douglas Murray and Fleming Rose. That's our panel. Welcome to you all. All right, so let's hear our panellists make their opening statements. So, first, for the motion, Europe is failing its Muslims, Tariq Ramadan. Now, he is Professor of Contemporary Islamic Studies at Oxford University. He's been taught by some of the best Muslim scholars in the world, but he's also very active at the grassroots level. He is President of the European Muslim Network. Tariq Ramadan, your time starts now.
Thank you. Let me start by saying that we are living in a difficult situation. If you listen to what is said in the European countries, the perception is very bad. 75%, for example, French people are associating Islam with violence. The perception is that Islam is a problem and that Muslims are creating problems. They are not really perceived at home in Europe. Every single European society has its own debates, its own controversies around the Muslim presence. The first one is the way Europe is defining itself. The current discourse and the general discourse is that Muslims are not European citizens. We have millions of Muslims that are already Europeans. And this is the situation when we speak about Turkey, for example. It's as if we are speaking about people who are coming from outside, not acknowledging the fact that we already have Europeans that are Muslims in our country. Not only this, on the geographical dimension, it's as if when we speak about Europe, we speak about Western Europe. Eastern Europe is not there. The Muslims who are being Europeans for generations and centuries are not perceived as Europeans. The Bosnian people are not Europeans. It's as if because they are Muslims, they are less Europeans. Our politicians very often they speak about their fellow citizens as if they don't know who are these new citizens who are Muslim and they are living with them. It's as if these new citizens are problematic because of their religion but not citizens as to their status. And this is where we have this confusion. We speak about cultural and we Islamize the socio-economic problems. Muslims in our societies are facing unemployment, discrimination and racism, and it's not because they are Muslims, it's because they are facing class discrimination, segregation and wrong social policies. At the cultural level, it's as if the new visibility of the Muslims is just showing that they don't want to integrate. In fact, it's exactly the opposite. The opposite, they are visible. Millions are visible. It means that they are at home. So when you have mosques, when you have organizations, it's not because you don't want to integrate. It's exactly the opposite. You feel at home, you build your mosque, and even this, it's also a very important point in the reality. So it's the opposite. When it comes to food, curry and couscous, that's fine. When it comes to money, Islamic banking, that's fine. But when it comes to dresses, when it comes to color, when it comes to something which is different, it's not fine. So we are selective in our integration. Money and food, welcome. Colors and dresses, no. So, last point, when it comes to the media, it's as if here we are only dealing with problems and we are dealing with these controversies every day. We are talking about violence, the minarets, the headscarves, all the problems, not talking about what is done at the grassroots level, the positive actions of the Muslims, the presence. Millions are silent and are constructive and contributing to the reality of our country. And let me say something which is important. The Muslims are understanding the West and Europe much better than before. They are understanding and rediscovering their religion much better than before. And I would say, yes, I'm supporting this motion because today we are failing, but it's a question of time, because what I see at the grassroots level is much more positive than what is happening today in our political discourse, media coverage. Things are very important behind. This is what I call the silent revolution, but we need time and it will be coming. Thank you.
Well, a very passionate and fluent opening there to our debate. Against the motion is Douglas Murray. He is the director of the Centre for Social Cohesion here in Britain, which tries to promote integration between Britain's ethnic minorities and the wider population, and it specialises in radicalisation. So, Douglas Murray, your time starts now.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Tariq says that Europeans associate Islam with violence. There is some truth in that. There is also a very obvious reason for that, which is that Islam is associated with violence. It was not Buddhists who flew planes into the Twin Towers. It was not Hindus or Jews that blew up the London Underground buses a few years ago. And that simple fact has to be acknowledged if you're even going to start a dialogue. Now, what is happening, ladies and gentlemen, it's not a pantomime. I'd argue that Europe has done not too badly, considering the circumstances. In the middle of the last century, there was an almost negligible Muslim presence in Europe. At the turn of the 21st, in Western Europe, alone, there are 15 to 17 million Muslims. That's a very fast migration, ladies and gentlemen, one of the fastest in human history. And no society would find it easy to deal with that kind of migration. As it happens, European societies, Western European societies have, I think, dealt with this much better than some would. Certainly, Muslims coming to live in Britain and in Western Europe enjoy more rights and better rights, among them freedom of worship, than they do in any Islamic country in the earth here today. We do have a problem. We have a problem when the failures of Islam throughout the world, the failures of all Islamic societies, come here into Britain. Their intolerance of freedom of conscience, their intolerance of apostates, their intolerance of freedom of expression and freedom of speech, their intolerance of minorities, other religious minorities, sexual minorities, their intolerance of gays, their dislike and distrust of half of the population, women, and many, many other things. And the call, what's more, for a parallel legal system within Britain and European societies. This is monstrous. No other group behaves like this, asks for parallel laws. This is a fundamental problem, and it's one we're going to have to deal with. It's a problem between a society, Western Europe, that believes that laws are based on reason, and Islam that believes that they are based on revelation. Between these two ideas, I'm not sure there is very much compromise for Europe. It is not Europe that has let down its Muslims, but the Muslims of Europe that have let down Europe. This is not solely something which we have to say we can never reconcile. Of course we can reconcile this, but we need to be honest about it. We need to be frank about it, and we cannot avoid things just because they are unpleasant. And if there were one thing I would wish Muslims in Europe could learn today, as fast as possible, it would be this: that you have no right in this society not to be offended. You have no right to say that because you don't like something you can commit violence, or you would like something to be stopped or censored. You have no right to have more hate laws or hate crime laws or hate speech laws just to defend Islam. You have to realize, the Muslims of Europe have to realize, that a society in which even your deepest feelings can be trodden upon is the only society worth living in. And the sooner we can learn that, the sooner that Islam can learn that within Europe, the better. It is not Europe that has failed its Muslims. It is Islam that has failed Europe. I'd argue Islam has failed its Muslims. Thank you.
Well, you certainly stirred things up a bit there, didn't you, Douglas Murray? Thank you very much indeed. OK, well, let me invite some comments from the floor, and let's go to the lady there. Yeah.
I just had a question to a few questions to Mr. Murray. I don't think it's the Muslims of Europe that have failed, the Muslims of Europe that have failed Europe. I think it's exactly the opposite. One of the things you said, it was actually a few Muslims, crazy Muslims, I think, who sort of flew the plane into those buildings. But was Hitler a Muslim by any chance? Because I'm not sure that Muslims had anything to do with the Holocaust.
OK. Gentleman there.
In 2009, the Centre for Muslim Studies, along with the Gallup poll, interviewed 500 British Muslims. Over 99.5% of those British Muslims found homosexual acts unacceptable. What was interesting is that the government has given concession to Muslims as well as other religious organisations. So it seems to me, in fact, this government here is prepared to give religious organisations, including Muslims, the rights over lots of gay men and women.
You talked about how Europe has dealt with this problem, and what you basically have alluded to in the 6 minutes that you had are that Muslims are a problem. And you're from the organisation called the Centre for Social Cohesion, and it's worrying that to have you talk about these things in this manner. What you are basically alluding to is that Muslims are external to Europe, and it's worrying that you see it that way, because then that means there is no chance of there being any solution to any problem, or Muslims being seen as a part of Europe and being seen as European citizens. Thank you.
Gentleman there.
I just want to pick up something that Douglas Murray said. I'd like to ask you, when you talk about the Muslims that are the problem, which Muslims are you talking about? Because you keep slipping in your language to focus on the radicals, the extremists.
Okay, right.
Maybe that's because that's what you're interested in. but there's another whole set of Muslims out there who are not like that.
Okay, just a quick clutch there. Yeah.
It is sufficient to point out that Europe is not failing its Muslims, that this debate is taking place tonight and is being televised by the BBC World Service, that Tariq Ramadan holds a chair at Oxford University. I put it to you because of these very facts, that you are being welcomed, that you are being integrated, that you are being respected. You are not a problem.
Okay, let's just take... There'll be another opportunity after we've heard our next two speakers to take more questions from the floor. Thank you. Now, arguing for the motion is Petra Steenen. She's a former Dutch diplomat who has worked in the Arab world, and indeed she's written about her experiences there. She's a very active human rights campaigner with a particular interest, amongst other things, in women's rights. So, Petra Steenen, the floor is yours.
Some people feel that in my country, Islamization has already succeeded. I think the question tonight is whether we in Europe are actually capable of looking beyond the color of religion. I was in Egypt during the 90s. Egypt has known about terrorism attacks long before 9/11, 7/7, or the murder of Theo van Gogh in the Netherlands. They suffered big time. And yes, there were a lot of things which I was critical of when I lived in the Arab world. Reading the Arab Human Development Reports, they sum it up very precisely. There is still a lack of freedom, there's a lack of knowledge, and the lack of participation of women is really worrying in those societies. The question, though, is, are those wrongs really connected to Islam? My friends like Douglas would say, yes, it is. A lot of my friends in the Netherlands say so as well. And they warn me not to be naive. They say that the danger now is among us, like an Islamic Trojan horse. I wonder, though, and this would be a question for me to Douglas, what do we do with the people who don't want to adhere to your ideas of enlightenment? Do we send them away? What do? Do we re-educate them? So I'm wondering, are we actually addicted to our own stereotypes? Over and over again, we hear the same warning. We're sleeping, Europe will turn into a certain Eurabia, Islam is about to take over. I believe that this one-sided, one-dimensional story is really failing Muslims in Europe miserably. I'm a regular speaker at in the Netherlands about Islam, about my experiences in the Arab world, and I sense a genuine curiosity among the general people in the Netherlands not to believe what Geert Wilders says about Islam, not to believe what Douglas Murray just said about Islam. They want to know the other story. And yes, you've all heard about Ayaan Hirsi Ali, I'm sure. And yes, she was a pioneer. But the other people, Ahmed Abu Talib, the Barack Obama of the Netherlands, the mayor in Rotterdam, Famile Arslan, a female lawyer wearing a headscarf, she got on the front cover of Time magazine. And my best example would be Ibrahim Afellay. He's a soccer player, and I wish he would score the winning goal at the World Championship. I'm sure that he will be 100% one of us. I am inspired by people who dare to dream. And I believe that we would definitely fail Muslims in Europe, but even, not only Muslims, every single citizen in Europe, if we continue to judge people on the basis of the color of their skin, the color of religion, and not by the stature of their character. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Petra Steenen. Now, our final speaker, arguing against the motion, is Flemming Rose, the Danish journalist. He's the opinion and culture editor of Jyllands-Posten, which is Denmark's biggest newspaper, and it was he, of course, who commissioned those very controversial cartoons of the Prophet Muhammad back in 2005 that sparked protests amongst Muslims right across the world. I see you're in the launch pad, Flemming Rose. Your time starts now.
In fact, I'm not going to talk about cartoons tonight. I've done that for the past 5 years, and I'm a little bit fed up with it. But I'm going to share with you my afterthoughts after having lived that experience 5 years ago and still experiencing the afterwaves of what happened. I don't want to generalize and I don't want to essentialize Muslims. In fact, I believe that every Muslim is first and foremost an individual endowed with certain rights and obligations. And as this serves, to my mind, as a foundation of liberal democracies in Europe, this is a very important distinction and caveat when it comes to the phrasing of the motion. It means that the citizens of Europe, they enjoy certain rights like freedom of expression, freedom of religion, equal treatment before the law, and secular government. It also means that Muslims, as other Europeans, have the freedom to choose. But unfortunately, within too many Muslim communities in Europe, European Muslims are not able to exercise the rights they are being granted by European governments and societies. And I see that as a big problem. So on the one hand, in a liberal democracy, you enjoy the right to freedom of expression, you enjoy the right to freedom of religion, which includes the right to leave your religion. You treat women and men equally, but at the same time, Muslims within their own communities are not able to exercise that right. And it's controversial across Muslim communities in Europe to leave Islam. And you have ex-Muslims or dissenting Muslims within their own communities who are living in fear because they are being accused of apostasy. Apostasy, according to Islamic law, being a capital crime. So if a Muslim decides to leave his religion, he risks social exclusion, stigmatization, or maybe even worse. So I ask, who is failing its Muslim population? May I remind you that it is human beings who enjoy human rights, not religions, cultures, and certain versions of history. And I do believe in the notion of universal human rights, and I think that this notion has served Europeans, Muslims, and non-Muslims well, one consequence being that the Muslim citizens of Europe, in fact, are enjoying more freedom and more rights than any Muslim in any Muslim majority country. So I don't believe that Europe is failing its Muslim population, as the motion claims, and therefore, ladies and gentlemen, I call upon you to vote against the motion. Thank you.
Fleming Rose, thank you very much. So you've heard all our speakers, and we're going to hear some points, comments, questions now from our audience here. But our audience were polled as they were coming in. This is how our audience here in Cadogan Hall in central London have voted. For the motion, Europe is failing its Muslims, 237 for the motion. Against the motion, 220. And the don't knows were 218. So this is so exciting because it means, audience, panel, there's all to play for. And incidentally, just before I carry on, I should say, you can download a free briefing on the issues being debated here today if you want to. You can go to www.intelligencesquared.com and just follow the instructions. All right, so let's hear some brief comments, please, and questions from our audience. Okay, the lady there, thank you.
I have one question for the opposition. Although most in this hall would agree that the human rights that are accorded to all of our citizens, Muslim and non-Muslim, are greater than those in the Arab nations, do you think that we have failed Muslims by allowing the language of Islam as against us to propagate on and on since, excuse me, particularly since 9/11, but even before that, and therefore allow our own Muslims within our own countries to feel as if they are part of the enemy rather than part of our own countries.
Okay. Okay, I want to take very quick ones then. Okay, this lady here.
I just want to make a quick comment to the throwaway comments made by Douglas Murray about Muslim women and Islam and its way it treats women. And I think that Muslim women are quite capable of speaking for themselves. And I think the sort of myths people like you put in the public arena, and I've heard other similar arguments from BNP and all that kind of stuff, they think it justifies their argument by saying, well, Islam treats 50% of its population in a really derogatory and whatever way that you like to explain it.
You've got a mic. No, that gentleman there, is it? Yeah.
Surely it's Islamic countries and nations and religion who are letting down many Muslims. The lack of correct investment in education, social justice and welfare in their own countries, which has caused so much social migration to Europe, which wouldn't have happened. But surely this lack of contribution to education and ability, especially of women, of freedom, has stopped this growing and contributing to Europe as much as they could.
Let's just take this young lady here with the headscarf, and then we'll come to our panel.
I'm a British female. I love this country, and I give this country. Now you're calling me a problem. I don't think I am. I think you are. Second point is, as a Muslim female, okay, my parents might not let me go somewhere late at night because people are racist to me. They tell me to go back home, and they hurt me. I got hit by 2 white guys, and they laughed at me because I'm a scoffy, okay? Last point is to Mr. Fleming, about the point where you said about the religion, changing religion. Every person has the right to. No one says anything about that. But if you had a daughter or a son that wanted to become a Muslim, would you be happy about that? I don't think so.
Why don't you just address that? Would you mind if, I don't know if you have children, but indeed, would you mind if they became Muslim converts?
I mean, it's their choice. And I can tell you, I am...
But that wasn't what she asked. Would you mind? She said, would you mind?
No, I wouldn't. Of course not. I mean, I am married to an immigrant myself who comes from another community than the one I come from. So, in fact, I have been living, this kind of experience for the past 30 years. And yes, there were some members of my family who were quite critical about that. But it was my choice.
All right. Hypothetically speaking, Douglas Murray, what would you say to that lady?
No, of course it wouldn't bother me. I mean, I would hope that if somebody has access... Look, what Fleming and I are arguing for is that people have the right to access all of the kind of opinions, all of the knowledge that they can. That means, among other things, having, for instance, access to all of the criticism that should be written of the Quran and of Islam. And if they weigh up after knowing all of these things and having access to all of them that they would like to become Muslim, I don't have a problem with that.
All right. Good. You answered the question. Petra?
When my daughter was born in '98, I called her Soraya, which is the Arabic name for Pleiades, because I felt that she needed to have a present for the rest of her life. After 9/11, people asked me whether I had regretted giving her an Arabic name. And I felt sorry for the person who asked that question.
So what's the point you're making? That there's prejudice against...
No, the point I'm making is, and I think it's the point the lady is making as well, that the fact that people are called Muhammad is probably, in the perception of many, putting them in a disadvantage. And of course, I totally disagree.
Okay. You want to come, because I want to get some response to what we heard out, some of the comments our audience made.
I'd just like to make a comment on one of the cases that Petra made, which was about Ahmed Abu Talib, a very distinguished public figure in Holland. What you failed to mention when you mentioned him as a great success story of the Netherlands, which I agree he is that after the murder of Theo van Gogh in 2004, he had to go under 24-hour protection because his name was found on a hit list from a radical cell nearby. We cannot simply take, Petra, the terrific success stories and ignore things like that. It is no small thing that a Muslim politician who speaks out should be targeted for assassination in his home country of the Netherlands.
There are many Muslims and Muslims.
Well, yeah, Tariq Ramadan, we get the point, yeah.
Once again, I think that you are taking one story. And then
it was the one she took.
No, it is, and many Muslims around the world and in the Netherlands were against that and attacked the small groups that were saying this. And this is the case today in Europe. The discourse that you have is helping to nurture this sense of alienation and not to let the Muslims feel that they are at home. And out of the questions that we got from here, people are saying, you are welcome here, and then in their own country. I'm sorry, I'm at home. I'm at home. What are you talking about? Don't talk about. So, talk to me. I'm sorry. Talk to us or talk to me as a fellow European and not as someone who is an outsider infiltrating the freedom of expression and using this. This is one. Let me finish.
Can I come back to that? No, I'm not saying you're not a European, but I would appreciate the following, which is that don't come to this hall and tell this hall that you're a European, and go to another and talk to an Islamic audience as Islamic brothers. Because that is what you have spent your career doing.
What's wrong?
Speaking through. Let me finish this. And Tarek comes here one day and says, we fellow Europeans, we all speak to each other as fellow Europeans. And another, he speaks to a Muslim audience and says, we as Muslims. Which is it, Tarek? Which is it?
I'm a Muslim.
You can't pretend you have two identities. Come just
you know what?
Can I say something about
But you are my...
Okay, you two, just a minute. We get your point. Let's see, Fleming and then Petra. And on this point, this specific point, can Tariq Ramadan be Muslim and European? And is there a problem with standing with Muslims and saying, I'm a fellow Muslim, but also being European? Douglas seems to have a problem with that.
Of course not. Of course not. But I'm not finished. Islam is not a race. And why is this important? Because if it's race, you don't have a chance to change it. I mean, communists were also being discriminated during the Cold War, but that's also an ideology, although another kind of ideology. So you have to insist that Islam is a set of ideas, and you have the freedom to change, to leave, to criticize, to ridicule, and so on and so forth. And it's very, very different
You have
from
problems with freedom
racism.
of speech and what you've encountered amongst some Muslims, is what you're saying. Yeah. Okay, Petra, on this question of identity, I think was the key one.
It almost seems as if the only good Muslim would be an ex-Muslim. And and so for me, how enlightened are we if we only welcome people who are like us? I mean, like you and me. I mean, can we actually accept people who think differently? I think this is when our values are really tested. And of course, when people are thinking differently and don't want to change religion, that's also a universal human right.
All right. But Petra, what about one of the questions that we had from the floor, which is somebody expressed the view that women have said that they enjoy more freedom in the Middle East than they do actually when they come to Europe, which is kind of sad.
In the Netherlands, we have a political party which is in parliament, which doesn't allow women to run for office. And I don't hear the same voices about this party as I hear about Muslim women.
I do want to ask about women and Islam, because this is something, we've had some contributions from the floor on that, and women wearing their veils and so on. I mean, this is something which does exercise a great deal of debate. The fact that a lot of people feel that you can't be a Muslim woman and enjoy certain freedoms. How do you address that?
No, I think that we have to acknowledge the fact that there are problems, but we also have to acknowledge the fact that things are evolving, that there are Muslim women in Europe today who are leaders in the leadership and coming with new interpretation. When it comes, for example, something which is very simple about the headscarf. It's against Islam to impose it, it's against human rights to take it off. This should be the point, and this is why we should be in agreement. Second point, against forced marriages. We had campaigns in Europe against forced marriages. And then when it comes to anything which has to do with reading the text, being able to come and to get a sense of autonomy for women, this is happening. So I would say that in some countries where you wear the headscarf, by definition, you can't be a free Muslim woman because the way you dress. I think it's wrong. Let the people decide and let them speak for themselves and listen.
All right,
listen, because sometimes they speak and they are not listening.
There's a big debate, I want to talk about women. There's a big debate.
I have a direct question to Tariq. What will you do if you find out that a woman is not wearing that dress by her own choice? What will your opinion be?
It happened. and I did it to, and I said it to some of the, at least now in my mind there are two, who asked me about the fact I don't want to wear it, and this is imposed by my father, and once by my mother. I said, resist. Don't accept something which is against your freedom, because it has to be your choice and it's an act of faith. So for the dignity of Muslims, you have to resist.
All right, I mean, there's a big debate at the moment in Europe, isn't there, in France in particular, about the niqab, the full face veil, and even people like Rachida Dati, the former French cabinet minister, has said that she is opposed to that. But Douglas, I want to ask you, you heard some of the people from the floor there, the woman complaining about attacks on her because she's described as a scarfie because she wears a head veil. I mean, that is something that you would regret. I mean, that doesn't promote social cohesion, does it?
Nobody thinks that any physical attacks or any such thing could be a good thing to happen. Of course not. Of course there are. Let's make sure we're right.
Talking about prejudice
exists in society. Let's just be absolutely clear as an audience. Prejudice undoubtedly exists in this society. It exists across racial groups, including from minorities to other minorities, after all, which is one of the things we see increasingly in Britain these days. And it is also the case that people, in particularly famously lower socioeconomic groups, are likely to feel hatred for other groups. That is one of the things that has to be tackled, and everyone, I think, in this hall, I'm sure, we're in agreement that that should be tackled. But do not mix up somebody, a thug, a racist, and so on, attacking somebody in a street with the right of Fleming and me to say what we see in the Quran, what we think of Muhammad, and maybe even asserting our right to say so.
Okay, all right, now... All right, the gentleman here.
I think part of the issue here is that at the point where Europe is becoming increasingly secular, there's a group of people who have a tenacious belief in God. And I just wonder whether or not if we had 16 million evangelical Americans moved here, I'd feel exactly the same about that. I don't think it's anything to do with race. It's just...
Okay, let's take some from upstairs. Yeah.
The biggest point for me is double standards. I think European double standards is the biggest problem. I mean, you talk of freedom of expression, and yet you kind of like compromise it through banning of minarets. But the point is, okay, people voted for it, fair enough. But the point is, you shouldn't compromise. You shouldn't give people, like, you can discuss taxes, you can discuss anything, but freedom of expression, that is not something that is up for tax. And it's just double standards that the West sort of holds.
Okay.
That.
You're referring to that referendum in Switzerland about...
And quite a lot of them, like the one in France, banning burqas.
Okay. Gentleman there.
My name's Henry Hogger. I'm a former British diplomat in the Arab world. I worked until fairly recently for something called the Muslim West Facts Project, which is an exercise to publicise the findings of some Gallup polling on Muslim opinion in Europe. One of the most striking features in that, I think, is that in Britain, France and Germany, that Muslims, when asked for how strongly they feel attached to the country that they live in, on the whole, gave stronger answers of loyalty than did the public as a whole, a sample of the public as a whole in those three countries. It seems to me that that's a strong and positive reason for arguing against the motion that Europe is failing its Muslims, but not the reasons which I fear our speakers against the motion have been giving, which rather incline to blame Islam and Muslims themselves for the problem.
Okay, thank you. The gentleman behind you. I'll come to you in a second.
I do a lot of work with Christians who've come out from the Middle East, sometimes due to persecution, and British policy is frequently behind that. So the world is very complicated. But what worries me is that a lot of the things that people are worried about Muslim immigrants into Europe are very hard attitudes that a lot of the Christians also have. And I think if you are, for instance, from a gay minority in a lot of those communities, it is very, very worrying. And therefore we need to be thinking slightly bigger than just this Muslim thing, but it is about a wider cultural problem.
Right, okay. The lady now, wearing the hat.
just a comment to you, what you said about women. I think, first of all, that's really misleading because you're getting culture confused with religion. And if you just take a moment to look into the Quran, you'll see the Quran gave women rights long before women in Europe started burning bras for their own rights. And you'll also see that actually in the Quran it encourages women to seek education, it protects us from violence, and it actually gives us rights in marriage.
All right, okay.
So you're very wrong.
Can I go upstairs? Yeah.
I'm Oliver Cam. I'm a leader writer for The Times. Immediately after the Swiss vote to ban construction of minarets, my newspaper published a leading article condemning the vote as inflammatory and a violation of religious liberty. But beyond religious liberty, beyond your, sir, right to freedom of association and worship, I cannot understand what possible claim your deeply held religious beliefs have on the rest of society. They are, in my judgment, flawed and incoherent and wrong. Why do I have any reason to respect them, and why do they belong in civic society?
Okay. Just some brief ones now. Yeah.
I was brought up a Catholic in Ireland. Later on in life I moved to England and I converted to Islam. Did my testimony of faith and I was ostracised by a lot of my friends. As a practicing Muslim was 2003. A few years later I came out as gay and I was ostracised by a lot of my Muslim peers. And then I became very isolated and I was lonely. I didn't know where I was. And I think the question today really is Europe, is it failing its Muslims, but are we all failing one another? And that's something that we should really look at. And I'm now in love with a lovely Muslim man and a good relationship, so thanks very much.
You've got the microphone, go on.
Hi, I'm Caroline. I'm just a human being. I don't represent any sort of party or community or anything like that. I respect all religions, and as far as I'm concerned, they've always shown respect for me, and I don't think that it's fair that we should judge an entire religion by a few fringe people, because if you count the Muslim community, it's humongous. You know, you can't just say, right, terrorism, and that's it.
Well, thank you. You've had the gauntlet thrown down at you there, panel. I'm going to allow you to perhaps respond to some of those comments in your closing statements, speakers. But while they're doing that, our audience are going to be asked to vote again to see if they have changed their mind, if they've jumped ship. So while the audience are voting, we're going to hear our speakers again, and this time they're going to talk in reverse order while we're just doing that process. So, Fleming Rose, Danish journalist who commissioned those controversial cartoons of the Prophet Muhammad back in 2005. Would you take the floor to make your closing statements?
I will speak against what I would call the racism of lower expectations towards Muslims. I think it's a big problem that people apply a different standard to Muslims than they do to other groups in our society. And it was very clear during the cartoon crisis, when in fact those cartoons were not in any way transcending the limits of the kind of cartoons dealing with Christians and other religions. I mean, by publishing these cartoons, we said, you know, you are part of Europe. We are not expecting more of you, we are not expecting less of you, but we are expecting exactly the same of you as of every other group in our society, and thereby we recognize you as Europeans and as Muslims and as integrated Europeans.
Okay, well, thanks. Petra Sienen, former Dutch diplomat, you heard some of the points that came from our floor, so do incorporate some of those in your closing statement, and the idea is to win over those undecideds so that they back your position. So make your case.
I hear a lot of self-righteousness about the values in Europe, which somehow are for a certain group and not for another. It's sort of a sense of superiority that we in Europe have done it all right. And I think this sense of superiority leads to sort of segregation in our society, which I wouldn't want to see for my daughter to live in. And in the end, I think the magic word really is compassion. Compassion for the other, compassion for another story, compassion for difficulties dealing with those stories. So I think that if we want to be citizens of the 21st century Europe, where we enjoy similar rights, civil rights. And I think one of the things we could have learned from the American experience is a civil rights movement. So I think attention for civil rights in our schools, in our systems, is really necessary. Thank you.
Okay. Douglas Murray, Director of the Centre for Social Cohesion, a think tank which studies radicalisation and extremism in Britain. Your closing statements.
Thank you. Well, first of all, just to pick up on a couple of people, particularly women, who've said about the terrific things that Islam gives women in terms of rights. The first thing is, yes, in 7th century Arabia, some of this was progressive. In 21st century Britain, it is not. And you have to make that fundamental admission that the Quran is not a document for women's rights in Europe in 2010. It is not. Secondly, why is it that only Islamic societies and mosques in this country are places which teach and preach hatred of other minorities? Every single week in this country, there are people on campuses who teach the murder of minorities. Last week, it was somebody who calls for the murder of apostates. The week before, at another university, it was somebody who believes the Jews are fair game. This is not tolerable. It is not tolerable for Muslims. It is not tolerable from anyone else. You, I hope, would agree with me that any minority that engaged in such hatred and bigotry should be criticised. Don't pretend that the cloak of Islam and Islamic belief and religious fervour means that people like us cannot say that people who call for the murder of minorities are not mainstream, are not acceptable, and have to be critiqued.
So, Tariq Ramadan, Professor of Contemporary Islamic Studies at Oxford University. Final word goes to your closing statement, incorporating some of the points raised by our audience.
Thank you for that, and welcome to social cohesion. That's really nice. So I would say here that when we look at what is happening now, I am saying yes, now Europe is failing its Muslims as something which is the global, the overall picture. Now when we come with time, what is happening in Europe now is quite different. And this is what I call the silent revolution. When we look at what is going on at the grassroots level with citizens that are European Muslims and Muslim Europeans, and they are here and they are going to stay, and they are going now to go to something which is not to talk about integration. They are all fed up with integrate. Now they contribute, now they give, now they build, and this is it. So, to respond to what you said, I would agree with you that the feeling of the Muslims that they are at home, but for the time being we still have to work. This is why I'm saying yes, we are failing our Muslims, and we have to work together to change this perception and to change the reality. And the first I'm addressing here, and by the way, you know, I can call you brother in humanity. I did it yesterday, I am going to do it today, I'm going now to tell you this. It's not a problem for me to say to my brothers and sisters in humanity, in religion, and as citizens that we are brothers and sisters. If you have a problem with brotherhood, it's not my problem. So the point here is, and please, we have been talking about what doesn't work. Let us speak about what works at the grassroots level.
All right, let me give you the result now. So let me remind you that before the debate, as you in the audience here were coming in, 237 of you were for the motion, 220 were against, and the don't knows were 218. This is how you've voted after you've heard our panel make their presentations. You've also put your comments. So after the debate, for the motion, Europe is failing its Muslims, only slightly gone up, 249. Against the motion, 346. And the don't knows have gone from 218 to 84. So Europe is failing its Muslims. Against have won. Douglas Murray and Fleming Rose, congratulations to you. Our thanks to all our speakers, to the British Council for making this very important debate possible, to you here in the audience at Cadogan Hall in central London, of course, you at home who are watching. I'm going to go and celebrate with the winners and commiserate with the losers. From me, Zainab Badawi. Goodbye. Thank you.